We are here to introduce the next program, next of the postgraduate programs here at Strelka, saying goodbye to the 3 years of the new normal and beginning another chapter. I wanted to first, before we begin, to say some thank yous to the institute here, the education team, the design team, the Strelka Press, the communications team, specifically the designer of the new Terraforming identity, Nastya Vishnikova, who I think did a really fantastic job. So a couple nights ago, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Strelka Institute here. And so with this new program, we launched the next 10 years of the collaboration and initiative here. So it's my pleasure then to introduce the Terraforming, which will be the next of the postgraduate programs. It represents a reboot, a refresh, all new research themes, new topics, new faculty, new projects. And so next hour or so, I will discuss at length, introduce what we're going to be up to, and to invite you to apply, to participate in this. But first, I want to tell a story about an image, or rather something that a planet, our planet, recently made that we interpret as being an image because it has to do with where we, the humans, fit into the scheme of things. And the story is about this image, one taken by Event Horizon. The image that you see here is of the black hole M87. Perhaps to our shame, there never was a grassroots movement asking the question, why haven't we seen an image of a black hole, as there was of Earth? But nevertheless, one did appear in 2019 and immediately took its place among a small group of the most significant images ever made by human technology. The thing we see as an image was constructed from data produced not by a normal camera, but, as I say, by Event Horizon, a network of telescopes harmonized to focus on the same location at the same time. Now, the resolution of any image depends on the aperture of the camera, and this discontiguous perception machine linked telescopes from Greenland to Antarctica, an aperture as wide as the Earth itself. So to make this image, our planet literally became the camera, peering out and looking back in time at the ancient light that traveled to Earth, and indeed, in this case, looked out at time and gravity. So the 2019 black hole image is a kind of world picture, but crucially, it's not a picture of our Earth, but rather a picture taken by the Earth of its surroundings, for which we served as essential enablers. So imagine a planet wrapped in the Event Horizon telescope array as a kind of amoeba-like creature, at long last opening its little eye to sense what's nearby. With its coordinated sensory cells, it sees not only that the space around it is empty, but it happens to focus on this distant speck of hyperdense blackness, however unlikely that may be. So in the sensory data rendered into an image, we see an abyss in which we cannot be reflected. This unconscious, star-sucking void is blind and deaf to our orientations of horizon. The black hole is, in the best possible sense, a truly terrifying image. And so I want to then contrast this, the black hole image, to this one, the blue marble image, with which we're a bit more familiar, and compare also where these two images place us. This image is taken from 1972. The American astronaut Harrison Schmitt pointed his camera box out the window of Apollo 11 and took several images, one of which became Blue Marble, a picture that would come to adorn 1 billion t-shirts and coffee mugs. In addition to providing a visual identity for the nascent ecological movement, it symbolized what Frank White would later term the overview effect, that a numinous feeling of profound awareness felt by many who have experienced space flight and have seen the entirety of our pale blue dot all at once. It's well known, however, that the original image taken by Schmitt had the South Pole positioned above Africa, but that the version publicly disseminated deliberately rotated that perspective to place the southern hemisphere below the northern hemisphere in accordance with mapping conventions and other primitive hierarchies. But we might ask, what orientation is in fact true? The Mercator projection, or the two-dimensional map with which you're familiar, is a world picture drawn from a virtual perspective of what is up in space, and as such gave orientation to a global geopolitical era. But to finally decolonize the blue marble image would not be just to unflip it, putting up and down back where they belong, but rather to affirm that from this outside, all such orientations are arbitrary. The whole tradition is feeble. All horizons are false in this way. As Sun Ra put it, space is not only high, it's low. It's a bottomless pit. So if blue marble signaled a revitalized alloy of humanism and anthropocentrism made by a single person looking in the mirror and framing his sense of place, looking down from above, then the black hole reveals a far more powerful inhuman scope and condition that defies articulation as it looks not only up but out. If blue marble implied a global village by putting apex creationists in charge of a mythical garden, black hole demands a planetary regime by rendering humans as a privileged mediating residue that sets in motion further generalized cognitions. The two worlds could not be more different. And this is a new profile, a new position for us, all of us, that will take some getting used to. So, accordingly, we explore a renewed Copernican turn and how the technologically mediated shift away from anthropocentric perspectives is crucially necessary for both theory and practice. A Copernican turn by which we, the humans, are moved off-center, out of our intuitive framework, is also a kind of trauma, as Freud once suggested. But it's one that demands more, in this case, more agency from us, not less. Today, the Copernican turn is also a means for the reorganization of the Earth, not only as it truly is, but as it may be. This is then the process of the Copernican turn in a nutshell. A conceptual model develops a technical system to extend how it understands the world, but what is revealed about the world by that technical system undermines the conceptual model that made way for the technical system. This is how technical alienation is the basis of epistemology, not its cancellation. This is how the trauma, the Copernican trauma, is a priceless lesson too. And as said, the apparent paradox of the Copernican turn is that by puncturing the illusions of human cultural exceptionalism, the artificiality of agency and automation means that the planetarity to come will be more technologically configured and more anthropogenic. It implies more deliberate geodesign, not a release of liability through a renunciation of rationality. The dethroning of self-illusions also undermines alibis that allow us to remain innocent of how our planet has folded itself into fragile, transitive human form by which it acts upon itself and enables its own perceptual organs, such as the Event Horizon Telescope. So, to the terraforming. We see here in this oft-quoted passage that indicates that a decoupling of gross domestic product from global research use hasn't happened, but it says that that even if we were to radically reduce the amount of increase the resource efficiency, the efficiency with which we use available resources, and couple this with carbon taxation that would provide the economic incentive towards that maximization of research use, we would still overshoot this mark by a tremendous degree. One of the things then we're concerned with is what this efficiency might mean. And so for the terraforming, the concern takes us from philosophy to the deeply pressing and practical and mind-bendingly difficult problems of the design of that alternative planetarity. For example, in the research that we did for the preparation of this program, the year 2030 kept showing up again and again as a kind of deadline. Climate scientists warning that unless radical steps are taken to decarbonize the infrastructures of human civilization by the year 2030 and removing tons of atmospheric CO2, that the self-amplifying effects of climate collapse may be irreversible. Well, at the same time, economists warn that unless radical steps are taken by 2030 to address the consequences of pervasive artificial intelligence and automation at infrastructural scale, the self-amplifying effects of social collapse may be irreversible. And so both of these scenarios are well known, but they both point to a similar deadline, roughly a year from now. But they may be more interrelated in more fundamental ways than that reason alone. The climate crisis and the crisis of automation may turn out to be, if not the same crisis, then ones that demand a similar fundamental response. I'll speak more detail about this in a moment. So our program, the Terraforming Research Program, will then consider the past and future role of cities as a kind of planetary network, a crust on the surface of the Earth that we are able to occupy. The planetarity that comes into focus through this is one that appears to us through orbiting, imaging, terrestrial modeling technologies, satellites and sensors and servers all in sync, that have all of which what has made it possible to measure climate change in the first place with any confidence. And so that is one of the questions raised, I think implied by that black hole image, as we look back through it at ourselves, is where should the cities go? So as mentioned, we've just finished the third year of the New Normal program, which I think quite successfully. I should say, I think that the terraforming program will prove to be a more difficult research, probably more important research program than New Normal, because I certainly think there's more at stake. The New Normal was able to draw a dotted line around an existing condition that already was there, right there in the open, but was not so obvious because people didn't know quite how to look at it. But once you saw it, it became obvious and you couldn't unsee it. So if the New Normal worked with the grain, the terraforming works against it at a particular oblique angle. We'll work with topics that are familiar, but in ways that are not. And this will, we hope, align elements into a new perspective that becomes, in itself, useful, if in a difficult way, for us, and more importantly, for others to work. So, the title, The Terraforming, refers both to the terraforming that has already taken place in recent centuries as urbanization to date as a kind of terraforming process, and more importantly, to the terraforming that must now be planned and conducted as the planetary design initiative of the next centuries, if true catastrophes are going to be prevented. It appears that in a bit of reply to a famous quote from Frederick Jameson that goes, "The glory of the Anthropocene, however, has been to show that we really can change the world. Now it would be intelligent to terraform it." And so this is the important point. The terraforming here, well, terraforming as usually refers to the transformation of ecosystems of other planets or moons or whatever to make them capable of supporting Earth-like life. The looming ecological consequences of what is called the Anthropocene suggest that in the decades to come, we will need to terraform Earth if it is to remain a viable host for Earth-like life. And so the next Strelka program will explore then this implication of this proposition for urbanism at a planetary scale, a venture that is undoubtedly and admittedly full of risk, technical, philosophical, biological. But to do so means working neither with a blank page reset, nor risk mitigating incrementalism, but a projective encounter with an uncannily super-functional necessity. So this, our program guide and manifesto of sorts, this short book, available over here for your benefit, was written over the course of the month of July. Each titled paragraph can be read one at a time, but the sequence does matter. The book is dense in ideas, each of which will be, I hope, unpacked over the course of the program, for which it serves as an opening brief, manifesto, salvo offering. It is a, I hope, narrowly targeted polemic against both the dominant modes of planetarity and a rejoinder to the inadequacies seen in how critical philosophy and design has to date seeks to confront them. A few of the ideas you'll find here. One is a criticism of all the ways that we continue to appeal to nature as a kind of outside that would provide some conclusive path for us out of the Anthropocenic condition. As I've written, there is no, there is no nature, quote unquote, of course. The very notion of an outside of culture is a discredited but persistent notion. And yet the inverse of this is probably harder to swallow. That is, because there is no nature, there's also no culture. There's chemistry, abstraction, phase change, pattern, and collapse, and other things besides. So next is the notion of the artificial. The implications of the shift to an urban planetarity are perhaps counterintuitive. Instead of receiving ideas of nature, we will claim and reclaim the artificial, not as in fake, but rather as in designed, as in having been made and deliberately, as a foundation which links the mitigation of anthropogenic climate change to the geopolitics of automation. Now, no two cultures, it is sure, define artificial in the same way. And as we said, no two cultures would define intelligence in the same way, and so no two will define artificial intelligence in the same way either. But diagnosing how climate change is anthropogenically artificial, that is, man-made, is not then to redraw boundaries or borders between human culture over here and nature over there, but rather to recognize that intelligence is what makes anomalously regular patterns regular. In other words, climate change's epistemic challenge to everyone is that the entire world has become an exercise in interpreting what is and isn't artificial. The implication is that our response to climate change must be resolutely anthropogenic as well. To be successful, it must be adamantly and unapologetically artificial. We argue as well that automation should be seen not as some secondary addition to the techno-ecological processes at work, but a name for them, for how abstraction automates itself. For this, geographic scale automation is seen not as part of is seen as part of an expanded landscape of information and agency, labor, and energy that is a living ecology, not a substitute for one. So, for all of this, it is for an urbanism that is pro-planning, pro-artificial, anti-collapse, pro-universalist, anti-totality, pro-materialist, anti-Leviathan, and anti-mythology, and pro-egalitarian distribution. It starts with, inevitably then, a different set of assumptions. And I'm going to quickly name those and then go through one by one before introducing our new faculty. These are that the planet is artificially sentient, that climate collapse mitigation and pervasive automation can and must converge, that the concept of climate change itself is an accomplishment of planetary scale computation, that automation is a general principle by which ecosystems work, that necessary shifts in geotechnology are likely to precede the necessary shifts in geopolitics, that the surveillance, quote unquote, of carbon flows and energy flows is a good thing, that energy infrastructures based on long-term waste cycles are desirable, that for ecological carrying capacity, culture costs more than technoscience, and that planetarity requires a philosophy in and of outer space, and finally, that speculative design must focus on what is so deeply functional as to be unlikely. So let me then get to the heart of it and unpack these a bit for you. First, that the planet is artificially sentient. The Earth has been wrapped in a sensing instrumental weave and calculative infrastructure that extends down into the subterranean cloud platforms and out to the ring of satellites, pointing both in and out, that produce images for us of what is high and what is low. The Copernican turn here is that through all of this, the planet has become not only an object that can be known, it has become itself a kind of distributed subject that is not reducible to our intentions and plots. 2, the concept of climate change itself, the concept, not the effect, the concept, the pattern recognition, is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. So, asked in isolation, the question, what is it and how can planetary scale computation contribute to conceptual shifts and applied interventions in and against climate change, fails to see that quote-unquote climate change is itself, as an idea, something brought about to us by planetary scale computation. In its embryonic form, this accidental megastructure was used for global weather modeling. In its mature form, it has been employed in and as earth science. The notion, the statistical model of climate change, is an empirically validated pattern drawn from a comprehensively planetary scale, biopolitical sensing, surveillance, modeling, and calculative apparatus. That most artificial of innovations, the stack, is what made this most significant artificial abstraction, climate change, into a legible and communicable concept. You're welcome. 3, climate collapse mitigation and pervasive automation must converge. The response to climate change may depend on how we deal with the implications of a more pervasive, algorithmically governed automation of production and governance itself. While the response to the crisis of automation may depend on how we deal with the implications of decarbonization, molecular governance, and the reversing of diversity loss. That is, put simply, the question of automation is inside the question of climate change and cannot be successfully engaged otherwise, while the question of climate change is also inside the question of automation and cannot be addressed otherwise. As such, the response, the plan, if you like, entails a radical redeployment of geotechnical means towards the ends of ameliorating the global geochemical meltdown. As for what the architecture of a maximalization of resource allocation looks like, and after massive carbon tax, it may look more like this. This is what green architecture really looks like. 4, automation is a general principle by which ecosystems work. We would define automation not as the synthetic transference of natural human agency into external technical system, but rather as the condition by which action and abstraction are codified into relays through both living bodies and non-living media. And this more ecological conception of automation is then one of the conditions that we think is revealed, has always already been there, by the intensification of algorithmic intelligence today. It speaks to, in other words, the already cyborgian condition of our species, of our agency, of our industry, and of our cultural dramas, much more than it does about the contemporary concern of proper humans being replaced improperly by machines. 5, what we call geoengineering, or what is called geoengineering, must be redefined as something that refers to the scale of design effect, not a type of technology. So as part of the particular way that we would want to further collapse the nature-culture divide, the term geoengineering needs to be reappropriated and redefined to include much more than strange new schemes for cloud seeding. It should refer to the scale of design, and more specifically to the scale of design effect, including the prevention of carbon sinks from being destroyed. This is geoengineering too. So the program of geoengineering, so defined, needs to be framed not as a kind of omniscient reductive control of ecological mechanisms, but as the sober, practical, geotechnically minded, and geopolitically sensitive coming to grips with anthropogenic ecological effects. By way of, I introduce then by way of evidence to make sure I'm not understood on this point. We see here on the image on the left and behind is taken from yesterday of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. The image on the right is Siberia, both burning, both on fire. To stop and reverse this is also geoengineering. And so are the negative emissions technologies that subtract heat and carbon that are have already been expended into the atmosphere. Recent IPCC report concludes that it is not possible to meet our temperature goals, making sure that the global mean temperatures does not rise above 2 centigrade, for example, without pulling heat and carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there. We need to capture and remove the carbon and heat that's already accumulated in the atmospheric shell. There's no way around it. So the scope and potential of these negative emissions technologies, whatever they are, must include both passive methods, like letting the Amazon recover to its pre-industrial footprint, and active measures, perhaps like direct carbon capture. But geoengineering by whom? It's not an easy question. Picture here from a few weeks ago of this slum in Bangladesh that caught on fire because of a heat wave. 50,000 people lost their homes. Now, as Kim Stanley Robinson imagines it, direct geoengineering schemes, which are risky as hell, may first be deployed not by some Silicon Valley Dr. Evil character, but by, instead, an equator-adjacent government who has just watched hundreds of thousands of its own people die in a heat wave. They may look to the north and say, you have no moral standing to tell us not to attempt this. The North's nervous counter-argument that the secondary and tertiary effects of transforming planetary geochemistry affects everyone and requires a planetary scale planning and regulatory platform is true and valid, and we should heed our own words today. This is what we should be doing right now, figuring out how to prevent scenarios such as these. It's also one of the ways that the implementation of a new geotechnology may hasten the formation of a new geopolitics in its image. Which is the next point. 6, the necessary and fundamental shifts in geotechnology are likely to precede the fundamental shifts in geopolitics. Instead of changing people's minds and then we will have the means to fix the problem, we may need to fix the problem which will then change people's minds. because you can't use technologies at this scale without also changing the institutional mechanisms that would employ them and part of how that they're used. And this would inevitably radically expand the range of techniques that are available, which would alter the very notion of what geopolitics is in the image of the terraforming project that it comes to assume. There's a certain presumption, I think, that to deal with climate change, for example, through ethics, morality, and politics, is about radical change, whereas an interest in the technological interventions is somehow the defense of a status quo. I think we may suggest that the inverse of this is in fact perhaps more likely. To govern a geotechnology capable of making a difference may require, must require, I think, the emergence of a new sort of geopolitics that would never have appeared merely by discourse. 7. The quote-unquote surveillance of carbon flows is better than the surveillance of individual humans, which is what we have trained planetary scale computation on to date. And in fact, the emphasis on individual action, individual ethics, is a big part of the problem. The geotechnology that looks like a geopolitics, and vice versa, is probably not about the accounting of people, individual persons, and what are you doing. It's about something else. It's about how the planet works directly. And this is another kind of Copernican turn. It's about the accounting of geologic and chemical and energy flows itself, directly. And so that vast machine of climate science, that vast machine of climate science is not really, is not just about how the planet is so conceived, but it's also the construction of the sensing media that are necessary to do this, to actually to sense this and to surveil this and to produce relevant information about it. The oceanic nerves, the terrestrial epidermis, atmospheric and orbital antenna, and more importantly, that amalgamation of both this instrumentation and the Earth itself. So whereas, by comparison, financial models also sense trillions of entities and interactions according to abstracted value, the climate sensing apparatus senses and construes an equally complex but more diverse, in ways more diverse range of physical facts and seeks to correlate interrelations between them. The latter is much more difficult because molecular interactions at planetary scale are difficult to trace and indifferent to the unnegotiable reality that presents a standard, the standard economic ontologies are able to bend and parse. Now, I realize that for many good-hearted people, the idea of some kind of carbon and energy surveillance apparatus of whatever sort sketches out a kind of nightmare scenario. But in important ways, this is what we want. We want climate models that demonstrate a looming systemic risk to have the capacity to act back upon, to have feedback back upon the ecology that it is self-modeling in the same way that financial models are able to have feedback back upon the events that they model and directly or indirectly administer. This is a different kind of geopolitics, a different kind of geoeconomics. I don't see this as a kind of, as a sort of planetary polity, as a enclosure of the outside, but rather as a means to organize an artificial cognitive abstraction to predict the effects of the entangled forces of production. 8, energy infrastructures based on long-term waste cycles are desirable. Today, the energy systems that we have expend heat and waste up into the atmosphere, where it's unaccountable, where we have no means to trace its effects. It's going to be there for an enormously long time, but because it is diffuse, literally vaporous, it's impossible to enclose and capture. We have other options. 9, for ecological carrying capacity, culture costs more than science. Now, when considering the enormous physical appetite of planetary scale computation, it's important to differentiate uses and applications. The footprint of Earth science, as it is and as it should be, sensors and satellites and servers and so forth, is insignificant, is minuscule in comparison to with the carbon costs and energy costs of human self-expression. It wasn't climate science that broke the internet. It was the semiotics of celebrity bodies. The hot and heaving cloud engine is stoked in pursuit of moments of apparently meaningful performance and fleeting significance. What we use computation for is the issue. And today, if the performance and contestation of the subjective identity of people is that we need to ask, what is the best use of this teraflops? What is the best use of this mechanism? Today, in essence, planetary self-sensing doesn't cause climate change. In truth, culture does. And so what we wish to explore is not just a cultural critique, but a critique of culture itself. 10. An alternative planetarity requires a philosophy in and of outer space. The modern sense of the planetary comes from how we reside, how it is that we who have resided on the Earth have fashioned technologies that have allowed the planet to see itself from the outside and then to see itself deep in this predicament. The thinking and finding of the limits of our planetary perch and condition is how we learn to bend them again. This is what the Copernican Turn is for. It's what it assigns us. So from here, we look out into space, and from there, back in to Earth to orient what a planetarity should mean. And those questions of geotechnology, geoeconomics, geonomos, geoecology, are situated between the world as it appears to us and how we appear to the world as it gazes back at us through the technologies that we've made. Consider this picture of an astronaut on a spacewalk. We can interpret this image in a couple ways. Here is a figure, this radiating agency, who may appear, especially to himself, as a kind of executive agent incarnate. But instead of this frontier puncturing space cowboy, we might see instead a fragile animal in a shell, a pink putty sculpture, unable to leave his home without bringing an artificial atmosphere with him as he toddles, bounces outward. He is tethered to multiple umbilical cords encased in an inorganic placenta without which this little creature would die. And in a snap, we understand that his condition is not some superhuman exception, but it's the same as ours here down on the surface. We too, each of us would die without our automated life support systems. So what at first glance looks like something that is autonomous, self-governing, set apart, able to decide things on its own, is, upon closer inspection, always a condition that is decided in advance by remote ancestral agents and relays, and thus it is always automated as well. Lastly, speculative design must focus on what is so deeply functional as to be unlikely. The new program, like the new normal, remains one of speculative urban futures, but only because each of these three terms is undecided and therefore alive. The speculative here refers not to some whimsically creative attitude, but to what is so functional and necessary, even if also equally unlikely, that it makes conventional schemes, however likely they may be to be repeated, seem like lunacy in comparison. And this is, I think, in fact, our general predicament. Not only is business as usual psychotic, but the normal genres of concerned response are also deeply neurotic, even delusional. This doesn't mean, in this observation of limits, that we can't have beauty. This is the work of Galina Belashova, who was the architect of the interiors of many of the Soviet spacecraft. And I think for us, space design is immediately relevant because it is defined directly by an inhospitable emergency environment of outer space. The beauty of habitats designed for such conditions has much to tell about the habitats we should be making down here on the Earth's crust. Because from emergency comes emergence. Creativity doesn't best come from a blank page, but from constraints so deep and so weird that no conventional common sense can be useful. So, one last point then about our research agenda, and then I will introduce our faculty. Our research is prefigurative, but we mean this more as a kind of cognitive simulation than some sort of symbolic performance. We aim to contribute to a viable plan, and also the refusal of a bad plan is necessary. But that said, we bet that what may seem like an obviously and assuredly good position to take is in fact probably not, and that the vast and quickly changing expanse of Russia's territory, which will be the site condition for all of our projects and continue to be, will prove this so. The future has not been canceled was a motto, as you know, of the New Normal program. And it meant to say simply that self-validating, self-perpetuating collapse scenarios do not make a plan. It also meant to call on the history in waiting of Russian utopian thought, science fiction, and futurism as inheritances to claim. However, in the early 20th century, the future was an aspiration to be achieved. Today, however, the future seems less like something to be achieved than something to be prevented. Speculative thought is mobilized to this task, preventing one future so that another might, with luck, come to pass instead, achieved because prevented. Okay. So I would like now then to introduce the new faculty for the program. As mentioned, we are rebooting not only the themes, but who it is that we'll be working with. A couple people will bring along from the last program, but mostly not. So first, and I'll go through this a bit more quickly. We first begin, I will be teaching a seminar around maybe the 3 A's of the program: artificiality, astronomy, and automation, which will be based on our little black book here. We're then interested in understanding what we might call the geology of media, the archaeology of information, and a critical planetary mode and perspective by how it is that we may define each of these historically and theoretically. And so we'll be working then with Jussi Parikka, the Finnish media and technology theorist, author of Geology of Media, Media Archaeology, The Anthropocene, Insect Media, and Archaeology of Animals and Technology. He is a professor at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton and other places as well. We're interested then in this notion of alienation as a kind of productive position, particularly in relationship to automation, which is related obviously to forms of labor obviously related to the gendered positions by which we are situated, and the ways in which these are organized by supposedly natural conditions. And so we'll be working with Helen Hester, author of the book Xenofeminism, and professor of Media and Communications, University of West London. The Xenofeminism book, I think one of the more interesting theoretical books of the last year, is about the crisis of social reproduction and the possibility of the end of work. Here, the xeno is an alien, again, refers to this productive possibility of alienation. How should gender politics be reconfigured in a world transformed by automation, globalization, and the digital revolution? For Hester, this is grounded in the ideas of what she calls techno-materialism, again, an anti-naturalism, and a gender abolitionism. The notion of planning, how it is we mean to act and construe this terraforming, not as a kind of accidental, emergent improvisation, needs to recognize that our economies are already planned. We don't think of them this way, but the platforms with which we increasingly depend are planned. They produce synthetic prices, they produce synthetic economic models in which we are constructed and in which we live. And how it is that automation can and should take a different place within that economy and the distribution of value is core to the work of Nick Chernyshek, who will be joining us, author of Inventing the Future with Alex Williams, and more recently, Platform Capitalism. And earlier, one of the co-authors of the Accelerationist Manifesto. Nick is currently a lecturer in digital economy at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College in London. We're concerned with not just one normative mode of planetarity. We are concerned with this as a way of rethinking, obviously, the limits of the human and so forth, of humanism, and how the positions of identification allow for the the conceptualization and actualization of other kinds of futurity in which we may find ourselves. We'll be working with Codwell Eshun. Codwell is a British Ghanaian writer, theorist, and filmmaker, one of the smartest people I know. His work on Afrofuturism is one of the most essential discourses that we will use in relation to the issue of the Copernican Turn, how the limits of a conventional humanism begin and end where a proper planetary can be derived and decoded. Among his recent films, O Horizon, done with the Odalith Group, we strongly recommend his earlier works, More Brilliant in the Sun, his works on and with Mark Fisher, and J.G. Ballard, been enormously influential in the conceptualization of our work. We remain, however, fascinated with the centrality of Russian futurism, not just for Russia, but for the question of futurity more generally, of how it is that the utopian project, the planning project, may be re-steered and re-derived, particularly in relationship to artificiality. Art, through artifice, has its own particular leverage on the question of artificiality, and particularly in relation to what we may call the world picture. How would we produce images of a whole and try to find ourselves in them? And so we'll be working with Boris Groys, art critic, media theorist, philosopher, currently professor of Russian and Slavic studies at New York University, senior research fellow at Karlsruhe in Germany, who will be coming back to Moscow to work with us here in the Terraforming program, particularly in relation to his work you may know on Russian cosmism, but also abstraction as moved through his work on minimalism and conceptualism. We're concerned then of interest in the different ways in which notions of geodesign, infrastructural design, its history, its policy issues, produce different kinds and enable different kinds of constructive constraints. We'll also be having this year a number of remote faculty who will be joining us repeatedly through video conferencing and participating in the program regularly in this way as well. Among those are Holly Jean Buck, who's a fellow at UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability, the author of a book that is coming out later this year from Verso called After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, which I think will be among the most interesting books of next year. She asks how it is that these kinds of technologies can be used to bring carbon levels back to industrial levels in ways that are more democratic, more decentralized, and participatory. Also joining us remotely again will be Jeff Mena, who we worked with in the previous program. Jeff is the author of Building Blog, which remains still the most interesting architecture and urbanism blog online. Its goal continues to be to explore how architecture and the built environment through the lens of technology and literature, crime, history, and archaeology, science fiction, warfare converge to produce our condition. We'll also this year be working with a number of Russian experts from various fields, as indicated here, who will have an extremely important role to play in how we develop the work, not only from architecture and urban background, but from many others as well. As part of some of the workshops that we'll be developing, those we are clearly focused on the issues of Russian urban futures, which means not only Moscow and Petersburg, it means a geographic scale understanding of planning, the proposition of platforms and programming of spaces accordingly. And so once again, we'll have a chance to work with Denis Leontiev, Strelka KB, who last year we did an extremely successful workshop looking at the eastern part of Russia, and ways in which it might be the constraints that it faces may form the basis of more radical and interesting kinds of conjectures and information. In terms of the design studios, we are focusing this year on the terraforming project around issues of landscape modeling, geographic data, critical information design. And so we'll be working once more with Robert Petrushka. Robert is an associate professor at Harvard, Graduate School of Design at Harvard, where his work focuses on geographic representation, simulation, narrative cartography, and spatial data sets. He has worked previously with Diller, Scafidio, and Renfro, Laura Kurgan, and so forth. You may know Robert's work have seen a work that became quite famous, a collaboration with Stuart Smith, along with Diller and Scafidio, Laura Kurgan, Mark Hansen, and Ben Rubin, and others, for a exhibition on the work of Paul Virilio at the Cartier Foundation in 2008. It's a work that has been copied and ripped off and remade by others so many times, but its clarity and beauty from that era still remains, and we're very happy to be working with, I think, one of the best teachers I know, Robert Petrushka. Additionally, with the design studios, we are focusing then on the relation between not just design and speculation, but science and speculation as the basis of a architectural conjecture, and particularly around new geographies, new landscapes. And also looking at how that intensively architectural way of thinking, of drawing and diagramming, remains not only useful but central to how we might develop these kinds of models of what is possible and what is to come. And so we'll be working with the studio Design Earth, which is Ronnie Agoshan, who is professor at MIT Architecture, and Al-Hadi Jazari, who is a professor at University of Michigan. You may have seen their work at the Kuwaiti Pavilion 2016, the US Pavilion 2018. The recent book, Geo Stories, collects many of Design Earth's really beautiful works and conjectures and models. This is the installation of their work at the US Pavilion in Venice 2018. These are some of the intricately beautiful drawings from the Geo Stories book for your consideration. We will, once in a while, get out of this seminar room and undertake field research far and wide, including the development of documentary cinema as the basis of our speculative. And for this, we will work once again with Liam Young. Liam is the director of the Fiction and Entertainment Program at SCI-Arc in Los Angeles. He is an Australian-born director and architect, and someone with whom the Strelka audience is well familiar. We are with Liam. We will do one of our trips to places far and wide within Russia. This is from obviously not Russia, but from one of the incredible films that Liam has made that traces in many ways where the planetary scale sensing infrastructure actually comes from. How exactly is it that the world folds itself into this kind of accidental megastructure? These are some stills from our journeys to across Russia, and this here to Murmansk, going for a swim. Here to a factory in the Urals. This is one of my favorite images that we've come up with. This is a factory where, in the Urals, where it's totally automated, and for various reasons, humans are not allowed on the floor of the factory, and so they've installed instead a Japanese meditation garden. We continue to be interested and committed to the conjunction of not just geopolitics and geotechnology, but also what we might think of as a geopoetics, and how it is that cinematic genres, new cinematic genres, may be able to tell this story and how to think in new ways and through different kinds of images. And for this, we will work once again with Metahaven. You know our research-based design studio based in Amsterdam. Their practice is notoriously difficult to describe, one that links poetry, philosophy, graphic design, and increasingly filmmaking. Filmmaking will take a particularly central role in the terraforming project, in the terraforming program this year. And Metahaven's exploration of new genres of cinema that link fiction and nonfiction, philosophy and poetry, are ones that we want to not to replicate, but to learn to think through and think with. We are also interested then in understanding, in relation to the kind of the creative work, the relation of artificiality and voice, sound and sensing, and technology's performance. We're reminded that among the first signals that we got from the planetary sensing system was one that we heard from Sputnik, the little bing that came down. The planetary sensing regime begins with music. And so we'll be working with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. Holly Herndon is a musician and singer based in Berlin, whose work you probably know. Holly did her PhD at Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. Hers and Matt's exploration of the relationship between artificiality and sound and voice and expression is among the most interesting we find anywhere. Their 2019 album Proto, which we strongly recommend, was a collaboration not only with Matt, but also with an AI named Spawn. We will then take another additional workshop here that around this question of space, outer space, and what we might call the philosophy at and of the planetary limit. We'll come back to the black hole image here for a moment, exploring how it is that in many ways we can't really ever leave the Earth, even as we are ourselves, the Earth, folded into the shape of people. We're neither stuck in that shape, nor are we open to any other kind of, open to just about anything else, but rather in between the project of how the human might be remade is still the assignment of philosophy. And it's interesting, there is, in the last year or so, a tremendous resurgence within philosophy and critical theory around issues and questions raised by outer space. And it comes after a long silence on this topic. In the Apollo and Sputnik era, the various philosophers, this is Heidegger, of course, had many things to say about the implication of this. Heidegger famously, in a 1966 interview with Der Spiegel, called "Only a God Can Save Us," said that when he saw this image of the Earth appearing around sort of the moon, that he was mortally scared, frightened. He said, "We don't need an atom bomb after all. The uprooting of humans has taken place." He goes on to say that we have only purely technological conditions left. There's no longer an Earth on which humans live today. But besides scaring a few old German guys, we may ask, and we may see that in a way that this silence in this era since Apollo wasn't really silence, but that the question of how philosophy and critical thinking, critical theory may address the questions of space was simply folded into other conversations about satellites and minimum closed-loop architectures, geographic sensing and imaging, the productive qualities of alienation, prosthetics, the geological condition of culture, logistics, the aesthetics of deep time, and indeed, the Anthropocene itself. This is what became of theory of space. But now, it's coming back in present. Now, and so for this, we'll address directly what we might call the politics of terraforming. And one of the references for this is the still, by far, the best book written about terraforming, Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars trilogy. As a base of thinking through. And another another reference from Kim Stanley Robinson is his notion of what he calls comparative planetology. And that is, now that we've landed on Mars and can take samples, we can actually compare what is unique and what is generic about our planet. And so, what better person to think through this with than Kim Stanley Robinson? And so, he will be joining us as part of the program. We'll be going through Stan's new novel, which will not out yet, but which is based a lot on themes of terraforming and geoengineering, as it turns out. We're interested then in increasing this area in what are called exoplanets. Exoplanets are planets that are outside of our solar system. And there are about 4,000 of them we have discovered to date. Discovered all of them since the early 1990s. And one of the interesting things for us about exoplanets is the way in which our scientists use data about what they must be like by tracing the effects to create a kind of a logic of place of what must be there. And in that realm of a comparative planetology, these are planets we can't directly go to, and yet can sense and imagine real, empirically valid things about them. They become a basis for thinking through radically other kinds of place or differently. And so we will be working with Lisa Masseri. Lisa is an assistant professor of anthropology at Yale, who wrote an amazing book called Placing Outer Space, an Earthly Ethnography of Other Worlds, which is about exactly how it is that planetary scientists see and can transform conceptually these sensed exoplanets, scientific objects, into worlds. We're interested, obviously then, in not just how to study this, but how it is that the question of design in relationships to these extreme ecological limits of space, that boundary of how our planetary perch cannot be ever punctured, is something that brings the convergence of art, design, and engineering quite closely related, in how we might not just think alternatives, but make them. And so we'll be working with Xin Liu, who originally trained as a mechanical engineer. Xin Liu is now an artist and designer. She is among other things, the arts curator of the Space Exploration Initiative at MIT Media Lab. Her works range from performances, installations, and apparatuses, experiments, and papers, and various interesting and crazy machines. We're interested as well in the question of philosophy about what it means to think without ground, what we might call a kind of zero gravity philosophy. So much of philosophy is based upon, whether it thinks so or not, our position to the ground and our position to the horizon, explicitly so in conservatives like Heidegger, but also in other places. And so we'll ask this question of what a philosophy without ground might be with Ellie During, who is a professor of philosophy at Paris-West Nanterre, who is in fact writing his current book is about exactly this, what a zero gravity philosophy might be. Ellie is mostly known for his books on Bergson, Einstein, philosophy of time, but now he's moved into this extraordinarily interesting new area, that physical condition that literally defines the break between ground and thought. So, as ever, we will take our cohort on 2 research trips, one within Russia, and this year we will also be going to Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of MIT and Harvard and a number of other interesting companies. And we'll be doing multiple laboratory visits, seminars, studio visits, and workshops with all of the above. And so, this is the faculty for the new program. It is I think, extraordinary group of thinkers and writers and makers from rather diverse set of entry points into the discussion of what the terraforming is, what the terraforming needs to be. But I should also say that there is, in addition, there's another faculty member who, among the, is already programmed, all of these faculty members will come for a short, intensive workshop in sequence. There is another faculty member who is here for the entire duration of the program. If you remember this, Nikolai Boyachev, who's here as well, who really, in many ways, is the faculty that keeps the glue together, and with whom we really developed the program from scratch. So, we always have these core research themes. The 4 this year, the longer versions of these will be are available on the website for you to see. They are Geonomos, which refers to what is the possible form of a planetary governing network? How can we plan for that constitution? The pressing assignment of a geopolitics and a geotechnology is now how to directly transform a planetary biochemistry. That's the object of governance. But that requires institutional means of enforcement that operate at the scale of the reactions and events that this is asked to govern. But how so? So geonomos is then that term for the real platforms and the conceptual logics by which that alternative geopolitics might be revealed. Second, automation is ecology, which I've spoken to in some detail, so I won't go into much of this, but this is just to iterate that cities are actual ecologies, that all ecosystems, wet, organic ones as well, depend upon automation. That is how abstraction works. We are deeply dependent on the chain reactions that keep us alive, and must now consider how the terraforming may arise from the sensible application of automation as ecological planning and vice versa. Third, what we call artificial metabolisms. The sooner that we accept that the artificiality of the planetary to come, the better chance we'll have to realize its most aspirational models. Cities are an inhabitable infrastructure drawn across the planet's surface that rely on artificial metabolisms of energy to operate. These energy systems may be behind veils that make their composition more difficult, but also protecting us from the implications of their industry. Lastly, of the foreign planetarnost, or roughly Planetarity in Russian. The terraforming is foremost a search for a new planetarnost, an alternative planetarity. Looking down from orbit, we see that all cities are space colonies of a kind, now linked together on an artificial planet already that is itself capable of incredible feats, like the black hole image. Despite the integrity of mutual ingestion, planetarity cannot be seen in opposition to plurality. Planetary scale computation did not bring the disappearance of the outside. It helped reveal again that there never was an outside to begin with. Okay, lastly, our own project work this year will be developed primarily through cinema and text, together and separately. And we, as ever, half of our cohort will be architects and urbanists, but we particularly, additionally, invite applications from those working in cinematic and text-based media, particularly combinations. Each of these, text and cinema, offers a different way, a different path towards the highest resolution rendering of an idea. With cinema, we will see it until we believe it, and with text, we can audit the semantics of an idea at full scale. We hope to bend cinema and text to develop otherwise uninvited tasks for both of them. And so, for the applicants, the terraforming, again, is planned as a 3-year research cycle, as New Normal was. 3 annual cohorts joining us here in Moscow at the Strelka Institute for the 5-month intensive curriculum, where we will once again develop projects in collaboration. Again, the cohorts are kind of model urban design practices, so far more heterogeneous than other programs. Again, half will be architects and urbanists who think and work at planetary scale. The other half will be philosophers, coders, filmmakers, scientists, various free-floating geniuses. Half will be Russian, half will be international, half will be men, half will be women. That remains the same, as does the program has no tuition. And again, indeed, the cohort individually paid stipends that allow them to work with us. This allows us to admit those who will most benefit the program and those who will benefit most from the program. Our work is trained on Russia and the complexities and trials and opportunities of this deeply strange and amazing country. Here is where the contributions to the artificial plan will take place, and where we will venture into areas that other contexts might find unthinkable, too strange, too problematic. Lastly, then, that is to say, some semantics and protocols and formats of that planetary to come may come from our most angelic efforts, and some, however, may come from a much darker place, and that's allowed for. The question bears repeating then, as often as needed: if the planet is a camera, where should the cities go? One last point. 1964, the Russian astronomer Nikolai Kardashev posited what he called the scale of civilizations. We had hoped level 1 planetary scale of civilizations in the Kardashev scale are those that can use or store, if needed, all the energy of their home planet. Level 2, stellar civilizations can use all the energy of their host star. And level 3, galactic civilizations would be able to use all the energy of their host galaxy. In 1973, Carl Sagan guessed that we're at about level 0.8 on the Kardashev scale. But in the meantime, we might ask, would even a level 1 civilization, that's one capable of releasing the energy of any terrestrial atom on command, including those that make up living organisms, constitute an unthinkable, beyond Lovecraftian horror? And yet, even if it were unthinkable to us, we who scavenge fossil fuels and set them on fire to power pictures on screens, this doesn't mean that it's really unthinkable or really horrific in any ultimate sense. I don't know. I wonder. We had hoped to have Nikolai Kardashev here at this event for the launch of the Terraforming. He unfortunately passed away, though, on August 3rd, which is only to remind us that time may be deep for the planet, but for each of us, and for all of us, time is always short, so work accordingly. And that is it for the presentation. I invite you to go to the website, theterraforming.strelka.com, for further information, purchase a copy of the book, and I thank you for coming for your time.